All right, well, we will get started, and good afternoon to you all, and welcome to another Centre for Volunteering webinar. We have a fantastic webinar. I say that all the time, but I really do believe this is a fantastic webinar because we're going to be talking about supervising and managing volunteers, and I think that's going to be very close to all of your heart. To help us out today, because we do have such a large number of people in attendance, please make sure you do keep your audio on mute and leave any questions you may have to the chat box. We will have time at the end to answer questions via the chat, and we'll also invite participants at that point to unmute themselves if you want to clarify your question or whatever the case may be. But otherwise, with so many people on the line, it will start to get very noisy and sound worse than some of the music I listen to. My name is Clint Burtonshaw, and I am the Manager for Commonwealth Programs at the Centre for Volunteering, and it is with my absolute pleasure I introduce you to Ayse Dalkic, who is our resident volunteer manager. She's also one of our project managers at the centre, and she's going to give an introduction to herself in a moment's time. But before we do kick into this, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the country we meet on today. And if you would like to acknowledge the various different lands you are coming from in the chat, that is a nice thing to do. All right, without any further ado, please allow me to hand over to Ayse, who is going to talk to you all things supervising and managing volunteers. Ayse, go for it.
Yes. Thank you very much, Clint, for the warm welcome. I appreciate having this opportunity, and I thank all of you for dedicating this time for this webinar on supervising and managing volunteers. Now, just a quick background on myself. I actually have a marketing commerce degree, and you would wonder why I am in such a role, but it's a bit of a life cycle. I started volunteering at a very young age. I got my formal education and then went into the finance and business world, and then life took me towards volunteering and fundraising, and volunteer management seems to be my calling. My volunteer role at the tender age of probably 10 was way beyond my capabilities of translating in a women's hospital to an adult where I was a child. So it wasn't quite well screened by my parents when they sort of put me into that position. So in the formal career path leading me into the Centre for Volunteering was been working for the non-for-profit in motor neurone disease associations with fundraising and managing volunteers there for over 4 years. And then that led me to a wonderful experience with the Royal Rehab in Ryde, where brain injury and spinal injury patients and disability sector was where we serviced, and I managed over 300 volunteers there, but it was a startup role. So that's really where I cut my teeth in putting supervision and managing volunteers to the test and learning through experience, and have been fortunate to be now in it on the other side with the Centre for Volunteering, and hopefully helping you in whatever field you're engaging your volunteers with. So Clint's actually going to help me with my processing the PowerPoint, and we'll just move on to the next slide. Thanks, Clint. If we can, okay, that's fine. So with volunteers, we actually have to always be mindful of the fact that we need to be respectful and have open conversation with them in terms of whatever the role it is that they wish to engage with, because they've got a selection of where they could go and spend their time, because it is their donation. That gift of their time is to you, and we are responsible as volunteer coordinators or managers to make sure that they are valued for the effort that they put in, for the time that they put in. They may even put their treasures. They may, knit and crochet or do art and share that with the organization that they're with. So the framework in which we should all work with and engage our volunteers in is the National Standards for Involving Volunteers and well, if you're in the non-for-profit is where we're coming from, our take on this. So there are guidelines in the national standards, and I would urge you to make sure that you work along those guidelines and be au fait with it, and ensure that you constantly go back and check yourself if that is what you are unsure of, or even if you're sure of, just to make sure that you're aligned and that your organization is aligned with what you're doing with the volunteers, and ensuring that you're onboarding them the right way, and making sure that that relationship is thriving for both you as the organization, representative of your organization, and for the volunteer who's giving up of their time and treasure for you. So the things that we'll cover today will be under the Section 5 of the National Standards on the Support and Development of Volunteer Management. You will need to address any expressions of interest from your community that will come to your organisation to show that they want to engage with your organisation. You need to have a professional framework around your volunteer program if you haven't already started one. Ensure that you sit down and brainstorm with all the stakeholders, and that background is so important in setting up a plan and a roadmap in how you want your volunteer program to be run and to be sustainable and to have retention, because once you've actually expended all your energies and resources of the organisation to onboarding your volunteers, you do want them to stay on. Some won't, obviously, life happens, people move on. They get opportunities, which is why they may have actually wanted to volunteer in the first place, which may be employment, upskilling to their profession, vocation, their studies. So it's really important that you are in tune with what it is that they have knocked on your door when they applied and wanted to become a volunteer with your organisation. What is their motivation in wanting to be a volunteer with your organisation? And that'll come out in the wash in these steps that are provided in the national standards. So the first note there is the volunteers are provided with orientation and their roles and responsibilities. How do you expose them to that? That is obviously with initially the volunteer application form or expression of interest form that they may fill out online or come and knock on your door, and you're able to give that information to them. It is important at that stage that you are able to communicate clearly of your organization's mission and vision, why that organization exists, what it is your purpose is in this community. And that is important for you to, for the volunteer then to actually go back and say if they are aligned with that organisation. It may be, for example, from my experience with Motor Neurone Disease Association, it was causal. Most of the volunteers came because they unfortunately had some experience with a family member or a friend who has had MND, and they wanted to come and support the organisation to raise funds, to do whatever they can to help get rid of this dreadful disease, for example. So same way with raw rehab, where families may have been impacted, unfortunately, with some accident, and they may have had someone in the brain injury or spinal injury or in the disability accommodation sector where we supported our residents in the community. So the volunteer application form, I believe, should outline where else it should also outline is your websites and what have you, your mission for the organisation. And having a volunteer come in and have an interview is the next stage, where you will be able to check on their capabilities and review their knowledge and what they actually want to give to the organisation. That's when they will give their frank discussion, hopefully, of their availability, their skill levels, and provide references to you so that you can do your due diligence in your compliance of this expression of interest from the community before they become a member of your team. So it's important for you to be able to analyse and get all that background information beforehand and not try and feel that you can just take anyone from the community and fit them into the hole that you might have in the organisation. It's more about you being all ears and attentive to the needs and the motivations of the person that's come to express their interest in wanting to be a volunteer. The level of interaction that you have at the beginning of your introduction to this person is going to actually hold you in good stead to maintain that relationship in a healthy, satisfying way throughout the engagement with your organisation. If you rush that process of getting the information, if you ignore it, if you don't take heed, for example, if they express to you that, or they've noted on their volunteer application form they have a bad back, you certainly aren't going to be calling them and say, we have a role for a volunteer who can push a wheelchair because the resident wants to go out into the community for access. Important that we are able to address the needs of our organisation, what it is that the volunteers are required to do, and have their roles and responsibilities outlined to the prospective volunteer, and as they progress through their orientation and their training into the role, that they come on board and have a proper role description and that they know of what is expected of them when they come on board. Once they are on board, it's obviously important that supervision is provided. That may be formal or informal, in that I delineate it. Formal in that you would have on your role description an operational supervisor for them, someone that they may be in the ward if they're in a hospital, or in a shop front if that's where their volunteering is, that they know who they can quickly have their grievance or their questions or know-how asked. Professionally, you may like to include that in the volunteer role description so that they know that if they have further inquiries as to coming to you and saying that they want to do a different role, for example, or that they're not available or that they're going to go on holidays, they are able to also say that to their operational supervisor, but also cover it with their professional leader, who may be the volunteer manager or the coordinator, who should have an open door policy for any volunteer to come and talk to them, because sometimes the other supervisor might not be available. So in terms of providing that supervision for them, that can be in many regards informal, in that you may be walking past the corridor and you may be able to see them and just touch base and say, how are you going? Are you happy with things? And they're the sorts of things that I'd like to go into further detail, but I wanted to make sure that we covered the national standards that are available for all of us to tune into, and make sure that we are clear and understand what they mean and what it means for us in terms of providing that support and supervision to the volunteer once they are on board. And in terms of the regularity and how frequent you may want to have that supervision, it really is up to you, but it would be best to have some sort of structure from the get-go, so you have that cyclical supervision happening, and whether it's best to start from the day that they start. You make a quick phone call or an email, hope you enjoyed your first day with us, and then it may be 2 months later down the track, or 6 months, or even annually once you've got them into a routine. You may also want to make sure that you're always available. If you're not the volunteer coordinator, or that they know that they can ask their questions to their supervisor. That's why I wanted to make that difference of the operational leader for them. and the professional leader for the volunteer if you're managing the whole program. So I think it's best to also go right back to the beginning in developing your volunteer program, is that you ensure that you've got buy-in from your board when you're being appointed to this role, or you are in that role currently, and that you find that if there isn't a buy-in, that you have a champion who can support you when there are board meetings. Make sure that your board reports are going back highlighting the efforts of the volunteers and where they are providing and following the mission of the organisation, so that there is that continual support for the volunteer manager and the coordinator and the program to be maintained. Admittedly, there may be times when, obviously, as recently with the COVID, how it has impacted our volunteer programs and where we've had to rechange and retrain and provide different support mechanisms for our volunteers. And obviously with the vaccination programs, all of these things make an impact, and we need to be able to factor in those flexibilities as we grow. It's not one size fits all with the volunteer program. It is definitely a tailoring, tweaking, managing it differently, as well as because the cohort that you may have is different. For example, in my experience with Raw Rehab, we would have volunteers who would want to be in the ward. There would be volunteers who didn't want to be in the wards in the rehab hospital. There may be volunteers who are only wanting to be at events because of the frequency or infrequency thereof. There may be people who just want to be able to help in rehab because that's where their vocation is. So getting your board, knowing that the volunteer program is there to support and enhance the service and the mission of your organisation is really important. For you to be able to get that understanding that they have buy-in is to be able to do an assessment when you are either starting up or being introduced to this organisation, that you find out what the needs are of the organisation, so that you're not just tuning into the skills levels that are being offered to you by the volunteers that are coming on board, but you're actually addressing the needs of the organisation. And that's really important, that you can report that back to your board and your executive level, and that they have the respect for the volunteers themselves and the volunteer program, and you as volunteer manager and the coordinator going forward. So if you're a startup in trying to start, or you're new to this whole volunteer management profession, I believe that you need to sometimes just take a moment, take a break, take a breath, and see and do your gap analysis of what it is that you're trying to achieve with your effort and your energy, because they've obviously counted on you. They know that you're going to be able to make that difference, but you're the professional leader of a group of people that you're managing and supervising. You want to make sure that they are right for the job. You need to screen them well. You need to do your compliance. You need to do your supervision on whatever frequency you've decided, and advise them, because on the volunteer role description, you should actually have, this is the role and these are the responsibilities. This is how we're going to support you with the training and the orientation and the policies that you can tap into. But you should also say that this will be under review in whatever time period you've decided. You may align that with the way in which your human resources department may be working with the staff, so that there is consistency in the program that you have. So doing a gap analysis and finding out what your cohort, your colleagues are requiring volunteers to do, I think is a very good way to start a volunteer program from the get-go. Don't be swayed by assumptions in that we think we might need people there and there. Actually do the analysis. Get on the grassroots, go out to the shop fronts, go out to your disability homes, go out and talk to the transport drivers and find out what they would love some additional help in, which areas that would be really important for your volunteers to be present at, whether it's the administrative side of things or not. So put that in your timetabling to make sure you take a little bit of a break and look and see if there is any gaps that need to be filled. So setting expectations from the beginning is really important, as you will find that the volunteers have come in with their own motivation of why they are wanting to apply for this role. And you need to be able to develop the volunteer program to address those expectations and manage those expectations. And I have already briefly outlined it, but we'll come back to the volunteer application form, or even the expression of interest form right from the beginning, to put it out there as to what your organisation does and how the process will be. And that if there is a probationary period in managing your volunteers, you say that from the beginning. And you can repeat that in your volunteer application form or the interview process. And it may mean that the things that you say in the beginning, if they aren't followed through, they may be the reasons why there are reasons for you to bring the volunteer in for a discussion and maybe some retraining, or even if in the unfortunate event that there may have to be a dismissal because they aren't compliant for whatever reason that we will go into later. So I've touched on the trial period and the surveys and the appraisals. You may term them differently. You may do a survey monkey in the way in which you want to manage your volunteers. It doesn't matter what you call it as long as you do it, and that's the important thing. The fact that you do it and you call up and you make an appointment, you dedicate time, the volunteer will actually appreciate that, because it means that you're connecting with them, you're tuning in, you want to hear them, you want to know if they've got some great ideas, you want to make sure that if they've been given a role that has, they're doing administrative work, that their ergonomics in there and the way in which we've provided the equipment for them, that they can do it, that they're happy and healthy in the role that they're working on. And that's important. I want to then go on to, beg your pardon, just missed a bit, to the next slide. So I've actually covered this, but if there's any gaps, we'll just continue there in terms of recruitment. It is a life cycle with your volunteer, and when they come on board and how long they stay. It's important that you have a selection of roles for your volunteers so that they can choose what it is that is currently available. And they may still say, no, that's not the role that I want, but I'd be really interested in this. Make sure you've got a log, a register of their interest and how they want to be engaging and whether the timelines may fit for that role, and that you come back to them. And making that time for them, it'll actually increase the respect that they have, that they are being valued in that role and in the organisation. And when you have events that they are included, just like your staff, in your volunteering aspects, and that your staff actually know who your volunteers are. If you wanted to provide them with an ID badge, it's very important for hospital environments that is available to them. If you have a budget, that you may have a t-shirt that identifies them, or an event where you're able to give them a generic volunteer Visi shirt, then that would be really good as well, because it gives all the stakeholders, your management, your executive, your staff, your other volunteers, knowing that there are other volunteers in this role as well, and they get to meet others, and that they can enjoy the work that you've asked them to do, and that they feel recognised and are acknowledged for the work that they do, and that they know who to come to when there are issues that they wish to highlight to you, or even if they need to have a holiday and have a break, that you're able to, manage that and maybe bring in another volunteer to be able to fill in the gap. You certainly won't be bringing in a volunteer to fill in the gap for a staff. That's definitely a no-no. That's not something that volunteers should be engaged with. Your staffing level is your own structure and your skeleton of the organisation. Your volunteers are to support your existing services. Admittedly, there may be organizations that are completely run by volunteers, and that's the way that non-for-profit will work. But even so, the volunteer manager hopefully has got a program, and they will be able to supervise and motivate and manage the volunteers, and that they will be provided the necessary training for their role. So if we just take an example of a transporting patients role for a hospital, or even if it's in the rural regional communities, just want to make sure that your documentation does cover the key accountabilities for the role that you're advertising for or you're recruiting for. This example is the transport driver. You want to make sure that you've given them the documentation that's necessary, but also the equipment that's healthy and working and operational for them to do the task that they have to do. So this example just is a very quick look at one volunteering role to assist patients in and out of their vehicle. So this may mean that they need to be trained in how to use the hoist at the back or the ramp of the bus. They need to make sure that the wheelchair, if it is the person in a wheelchair or on a walker, is able to be assisted properly and has the necessary safety mechanisms are in place for this vehicle and yourself to make sure that safety is right. That you have to collect the files, so that this may mean that you have to have a second volunteer helping the driver volunteer to make sure that the equipment is stored and stowed correctly so that there is no damage. And that you would make sure that if there are any incidents or accidents, that they are reported immediately, and that your register of your risks is adjusted accordingly. Because if something has happened, you don't want it to repeat. You actually want to make sure it doesn't happen in the beginning, so that there is a risk matrix before this task is a volunteer is appointed to that role. So make sure that whatever feedback you get from your volunteer, that you feed it up the chain to make sure that it changes the documentation if necessary, that the reporting has taken place. And if the volunteer has not reported an incident, that you actually make sure that you have a conversation with them to get the full details of the scenario of whatever happened, so that you can and make sure that it doesn't happen again. If you can manage that is the way in which it should be done. You may have multiple roles in your organization. This is just one example. You may have a volunteer who at an event is holding or pushing the wheelchair. And you, as I said earlier, you want to make sure that they're healthy, able, and not going to be injuring themselves. So you don't just sort of ask someone else to step up if someone else can't make it on the day. You want to still assess that person to make sure that they're capable of doing the role that you're asking them to do. You don't want to endanger your client base. You don't want to endanger the volunteers. You certainly don't want your volunteers to leave without telling you what it is that happened that they weren't happy with if you had to ask them to step up to a role. So it's due diligence for the roles that you are holding as a volunteer manager and a volunteer coordinator. Okay, so how can we assess that your relationship with the volunteer is right and it is going in the right direction? You can easily set up a Survey Monkey on an annual or a quarterly basis to make sure that they are enjoying the role and that they find it rewarding. Most times, if you've got a walkout, I guess that's something I've experienced, that is in itself your Survey Monkey happening without you wanting it to happen. There's something wrong. So before that ever happens, you want to make sure that all the communications are happening in the right time frame, that you're available and you're able to iron out any little issues that they may have. So sending out surveys is a great way to understand all aspects of their volunteering role, and if they're experiencing any difficulties, that they are able to communicate that through to their operational professional leader. Whether you're on leave, they've got somewhere else and someone else to be able to ask their questions and have it addressed. You would like to make sure that if there are any changes to your organisation, that they are kept abreast of it. For example, with my work experience in the hospital, the changes in the environment with the introduction of National Disability Insurance Scheme was a huge change, and there were times where we couldn't have an assigned volunteer because of the changes in the landscape of NDIS being introduced. We needed to just make sure that we were all covering, crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's where we could actually assign a volunteer to, and make sure that those difficulties that the organisation may be feeling is communicated in a seamless way to your volunteer cohorts, so that they know why they may not be called up for a little bit of time, but they'll be certainly addressed in terms of engagement, re-engagement, if there were those major sectorial changes that were happening at that time. And then if there are necessary, you would need to rejig your training to be able to make sure that the volunteer feels that they're adequately supported and know that they know how to do the things that it need to be doing, whether it's your administrative changes, your coding changes, your equipment changes with the robotics, for example, if that was something that you might be happening in the environment where your volunteers are. And at the end, it's important to have an exit interview. And that's, I think, quite a critical path in which you need to have some formal way in which you interview your volunteer and get their feedback on their journey, from what role they started out with, when they started, have that noted from your own side of your record keeping, and just reflect back with them as to how they engaged and how they enjoyed that journey of the different types of roles that they may have had, whether they felt satisfied, whether they felt valued, whether they felt that the role was actually necessary or not, and the support that they received while they were in that role. And that would be all covered through, hopefully, the training and the orientation, site orientation that you would need to have, because you may interview them in one area of the organisation, but they actually may be providing a volunteering role in a totally different area, which may be geographically different or departmentally different. So introducing them to the organisation via your first interviews and your consultations with them, and then reintroducing them to the operational supervisor that they have or working with, and then to the actual site, so they know where their amenities are, where the coffee is, where the other volunteers may be seated, and so they could feel that if they're motivated for volunteering because they feel socially isolated, volunteering is the best way in which they can feel part of a team and feel valued. And so you want to make sure that they're on a team if that's how they feel and that's how they wish to work. But if they are happy working on their own, you would need to address and find a role that's suitable for them. So managing their expectations is really important, and knowing it and finding out and making sure you're aware of it and documenting it, so that if you're not available, if you're the volunteer manager, but the volunteer coordinator needs to step up, they're able to know from your documentation what it is that this volunteer likes and dislikes, and whether they've had any grievances in the past or not. And if they've got suggestions, that you make sure that those suggestions are actioned if possible. And if they're not, you come back to the volunteer to say why they can't be changes, because for their role, they may see things from obviously their own perspective, but if they're working with professionals in that area, they would have the knowledge, the skills and experiences as to why things were done the particular way. Doesn't mean it always has to be done the same way, Some people may be open to suggestions, some not, but if the volunteers express that to you, I think it's important to go back to the volunteer and explain to them why. Some opportunities where you've provided an orientation and you've given them the code of conduct and their dress code and the confidentiality agreement and their media policy. They may have an opportunity where they've come to an event and taken photographs and put it on their social media with a client who may not have been aware that this is happening. So the confidentiality agreement that you've provided and documented to them, to the volunteer, is really important for you to explain to them the confidentiality of the people that they're working with, not to be going off and talking to their family or friends and expressing the names and the conditions of the people that they're volunteering with. So this may come back, if not explained properly, that yes, you may have a group photo, but in their own private social media account, but as long as they have acknowledged that and they've got permission from the person that's in the photo, this may lead to having a meeting with the volunteer. And if they don't understand that, they need to actually be quite clearly educated on what impact that is on the client who may not have given their express permission for their photo to be used. You should have in your program a consideration for timesheets or some management rostering of your volunteers. And if this is not complied by the volunteer in not submitting to you, that they've been providing that service but not giving you the documentation, this may also come to requiring an interview or a meeting back with the volunteer to re-educate and explain why. For example, the organisation pays for volunteer insurance, and they should have volunteer insurance and public liability, and that's also part of the national standards that you do cover the rights and responsibilities of the volunteer to be well protected and maintain their safety. But if your volunteer is not giving you any timesheets and not providing you any feedback as to where they were and what they were doing and not following instructions or not reporting any incidents that may have happened, it's important for you to have that management meeting with the volunteer. Which leads me to why we may have conflict. So it may happen that they are using the resources of the organisations when they shouldn't be, or using it to excess. So that is important for that to be nipped in the bud. They may have different values and beliefs. That's okay, but they have no right to be able to bully and harass someone else that may have different values and beliefs. And in that team work that they are volunteering, it's important to actually get a conversation that's open. If there is a grievance, if there is a conflict, that you're able to bring the parties in separately and have a conversation about what might have happened. It may be a very simple misunderstanding, but and they may recall things differently, or they may harbour different beliefs about a person that were unfounded. So coming back to what it is that the volunteers should be doing and defining their roles and making sure that those roles are adhered to is important, so that you don't go into a conflict resolution with your volunteers making any assumptions, and hopefully none are made by the volunteer as well. So unfortunately, there may be occasions where you may have to let go of a volunteer because of the above points that I've made. They may be not accountable. They may be AWOL in their reporting back to you or to their supervisor. They may not turn up. They may not communicate that they're going to be delayed or that something's turned up. We're all human. Things happen. We could be late, but we certainly have to express the importance of clear communication, confidentiality, and make sure that there's no conflict of interest in what we do, and as a manager, it's important for us to be able to be there and find that information from the supervisors if there is an issue, that we can nip it in the bud so it doesn't impact the rest of the team, and we're able to alleviate any concerns that may be as minor as having an assumption made and it was wrong. For example, there was an incident in terms of one of the experiences I had with appointing a volunteer to the brain injury unit. Yes, they were a young person, they were studying, but the way in which they dressed to go to a brain injury client was not the best. And therefore, if someone's had a brain injury, and this was a young person as well, the supervisor brought it up to me that they had to dress differently. It wasn't appropriate for the client base that they were trying to volunteer for. So, and it was very well taken by the volunteer, who was young herself and wanted to make sure that they were helping the client, but it was putting the wrong triggers for the person who was the client. And it's important for those things to be discussed and to be brought to the table, and to make sure that it's not repeated. And so the follow-up is really important in terms of making sure conflict is resolved and that it isn't repeated, and that we're moving forward in a positive way, and everyone's happy with what has been discussed. Okay, so if we can reflect back on our management, we need to look back and sit and say that, have the volunteers been prepared so that we don't have that conflict that we just talked about? Are the volunteers' hours, working hours, what they said that they can offer? We're not asking them to do things in the evening when they're not available, that they have the right capacity to do the volunteering role that we're asking them to do, that they comply with the things that we're asking them to comply with, and we help them through that program of ours to show that it is a professional program in how we're going to manage them. So therefore, we would like that reciprocated in the way that they are compliant with the things that they have to do in their responsibilities as a volunteer for this organisation. It's also a great idea if you can survey your staff who work with the volunteers. That is a great source of information for you as a volunteer manager. That is a way in which you can also find the gaps in which where a volunteer may have left, but you're not aware of it, but the supervisor is. The supervisor's too busy to come and tell you. So if you've done the regular survey, of your regular walk around to make sure that everyone's where they're supposed to be and engaging in the way in which they're supposed to be, then your stakeholders are going to be able to come back to you, and you've prompted them in how they can tap back to you and say, oh, so-and-so hasn't turned up for 2 weeks. We're a bit concerned. You're not aware of it. They haven't been communicated. So what's going on? So as a volunteer manager, it's your responsibility to chase it up and make sure that they are fine and there's a reason for whatever their absence is, and hopefully that they'll come back if you want them to come back. Okay. So we need to provide constructive feedback to our volunteers, obviously, and that will be in the process of, the supervisor's really happy with what you're doing. The clients are giving us this feedback through the websites, or we're hearing it from a third party. So if you've got that, whether it's positive or negative, give that feedback back to your volunteers and show them in which, provide training if there is requirement for that, to make sure an appointment's made and that training is provided for them. You need to be able to discuss any issues as they come up. It's so important. Don't leave it. Don't put it under the carpet. It's so important to be able to alleviate anyone's concerns, whether it's the supervisor who may not know how to deal with a particular volunteer, and you're the person that's responsible for making that match. So the whole matching process might be firstly from the interview and the appointment, but you want to also make sure that where they are assigned to, that they fit and that they're able to follow the mission of the organisation, and that the clear instructions given by the volunteer supervisors are followed by the volunteer. It's important for you as a volunteer coordinator or manager to be able to collate your information so that if there are any gaps, if it's training, that you're able to highlight that to the organisation, and a budget, if there is one. If there isn't, is set aside for that to be provided in the next phase of budgeting. So those opportunities where the volunteer needs to grow and wishes to grow, that is given to them. It's a part of management that you acknowledge the efforts of the volunteers and that you reward them. So there are multiple ways in which you can acknowledge the effort of the volunteers, whether it's your local community where you can nominate them, the Centre for Volunteering and any of the peak bodies in your area, the Australia Awards, for example. So wherever there's an opportunity to reward your volunteers, whether it's internal, and it could be that you've got a program where you know their birthdays, make sure that you've acknowledged their birthday. If you can't see them face to face, send them an email, give them a call. It's another way in which you're able to assess how they are and if they're happy. And it's also another chink in your armour in supervising your volunteers and knowing what's coming up for them if they wish to move on or if they're happy and they're staying on. So there may be the informal, quick little things in which you can reward your volunteers, and they may be the bigger ones, as I mentioned, with your nominating them for awards in the programs that are out there in your community. Please tap into them. Please tap into the Centre for Volunteering nominations and awards each year, whether it be acknowledging them. If you can't do it as a group or as an individual, you could do it at events during the National Volunteer Week in May, or the even your own Volunteer Managers International Day and the Volunteers International Day in December. So you've got your May for your the volunteer National Week, and then in November for the manager, and then for the volunteers in December, beginning of December. So remember those dates, put them in your calendar. That's all part of managing your volunteer program. And if you're doing it right, you'll get retention. Your efforts and energies and resources of the organisation won't be wasted, and that you can continue to thrive and impress your managers and executive, because there's obviously a budget there for you being employed in this role, and you want to make sure everyone's in the loop in it and provide news letters back to your volunteers, and let them know who's been onboarded recently, so they may know that cohort of volunteers is growing. You may have one different volunteer newsletter for your volunteer group and another one for your staff level, so they know where volunteers are being channeled. And if those staff members who are a bit reticent about onboarding or having a volunteer in their department, that will encourage them to want to put up their hand and say, oh, now I think I can work with a volunteer and I'd love a volunteer in our department. Some staff may have been burnt by some engagement with other particular volunteers in the past and may not want to have a volunteer, but if they see that you're managing and supervising your volunteer team really well, they'll realise that they're going to get the benefit of having an additional support person in their department, where they don't have to professionally manage them, because you've done most of the heavy lifting for putting that volunteer onboarded to their and then channeled into their department or section or shop or wherever your volunteering is in your organisation. So I think I've covered most of the aspects of supervising and managing volunteers, but if you feel that there may be any reason to have another chat with me or with my colleagues, there is a helpline now for volunteer managers set up by the Centre for Volunteering. You can call on that number or email us your concerns. We're certainly there to help you as a peak body to make sure that you're doing it right and that we can tailor things hopefully if need be, but you may well just want someone else to talk to if you're new to the whole volunteering sector, or if you haven't had a program that you actually have to start up. So that may seem daunting, but it's actually not that difficult. It's all about people management. It's human management, and it's about communicating things clearly, consistently, and ensuring that the volunteers have come on board for the right reasons in what they're doing with your organisation. We'll certainly open up the chat in a minute or two, but I also want to just highlight to you that I've got another webinar on the 13th of October, and that's about induction and onboarding volunteers. And it'll be my pleasure to see you again then.